much further than any car could. A place to hide when we knew we should. Where we plan to take on the world with all its strife, with all that's life. We learn to love, we learn to cry, we learn if you run and you give up, did they hold you down long enough until you knew what you were made of? Did you dance in the middle of the floor on a Saturday night? Did you try to take on the world? Did you leave me behind?
Oh, there we are. I'm told we're live, so that's very cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Amos Adetuyi, producer, film and television, working here in Toronto. First, I'd like to thank everyone for the opportunity to participate in the Windrush International Film Festival, and thanks Alan and Lindsay for helping set things up. I'd especially like to thank Dr. Shirley Chichu for inviting me to do a workshop. I wish her and all of you continued success with the Institute, and I'd love to come out there sometime. It's been a while since I've been up at Manitoulin. This is very odd, by the way, talking to a camera and not seeing anybody. So I'm going to try and get past my awkwardness and talk about what we're here to talk about, which is co-production. So first off, let me give you some background about myself. My company, Circle Blue Entertainment, is a television and film production company. We develop and produce across a lot of genres: drama, non-scripted, theatrical, digital, for markets here and elsewhere. So for the past 25 years, I'm pretty sure I've been a producer on about maybe 100 plus hours of primetime television, and 7 feature films, and actually 8 films if you include Boathouse, which is a feature we're starting in Sudbury early August. So to back up a little bit, let me tell you something about myself. I was born and raised in Sudbury. So back in the 1950s, my dad, a Nigerian, was actually the first Black man in Sudbury and to settle in Sudbury. And my German mom met him in Sudbury, and she couldn't even speak English. So if next to no Black people in our community, it certainly was an interesting upbringing for my brothers and my sister. An odd thing is that 4 of us ended up in the entertainment industry. There's writer, producers, directors in our family, a DOP. But for me, I'm simply a producer because I don't think I'm good at those other things. So that's how I ended up being a producer. So let me tell you about what I've been up to since I've started this business, being in this business about 25 years ago now. So on the feature film side, together with a couple of brothers of mine, Robert and Alphonse, I co-produced, it was actually a $10 million feature called Beat the World. It was the first dance movie to blend hip hop and parkour, which was quite an experience. Being my first feature, I had television experience, so that was something. Then the other feature I co-produced was Across the Line, which was about a high school race riot in the East Coast, and it had an interracial love triangle in the middle of it. We had Stephan James in the lead role, and Director X, the music video director, as his first time directing project. I then co-produced Gene of the Joneses, a comedy about a Black family that was coming to terms with its past. And most recently, I co-produced Angelique's Isle, which is an Indigenous thriller set in the 1800s with writer, producer, director Michel Desrochers. That's a more recent one. I hope you may have seen that. And then I co-produced a fantasy comedy called The Incredible 25th Year of Mitzi Bearclaw. I love that title. Written, directed, and produced by well-known Indigenous artist, filmmaker Shelley Nero. I will talk about Angelique's Isle and Mitzi Bearclaw in more detail as we carry on. I'd like to get into those a bit more. So on the TV side, my producer credits include 2 Canadian-South African co-productions. One of them is Akaya, A Family Chronicle, which is a post-apartheid serialized drama about a South African family that has ties to Canada. And it was actually the first Canada-South Africa treaty co-production, which is another form of co-production between countries that Canada has a lot of. With 60-odd countries, we have treaties. The other co-production was Josie H. Again, South African. There's a medical drama set in a South African hospital, trauma hospital. And one of the main storylines, interesting with this show, was about a Métis brain surgeon struggling with his heritage, who meets a Sangoma, which is a traditional South African medicine woman, and she helps him along his journey. So both Akaya and Josie H aired over 10 years ago on CBC, so you may not have heard of them. That's fine. Just shows you how long I've been doing this, quite a long time. So to bring it to more current stuff, I co-produced a dramatic series called North South. It's about a Black family, construction business in Halifax, trying to get ahead within a corrupt industry. And most recently, and I'm hoping you may have seen this show, is I'm co-producing Digstown, which is with showrunner Floyd Kane. He's a writer-producer that I often work with. Digstown is a legal drama featuring the first Canadian Black actress in a lead role. Now, like, why am I going through all these things? I think the reason I'm mentioning a lot of the productions I've been a part of is to make a particular point. All of the films and TV shows I just mentioned have all been co-productions. That is, I've worked with other producers on the production. I wasn't the sole producer. I think rarely in my career have I been a sole producer. So let's talk about what is a co-production. What is it actually about when you're co-producing? Well, it's kind of what it is, what it says. It's simply where 2 or more producers play an active role in the production of the media content. Now, it can be between 2 more people, 2 more companies, and typically, though, you're involved from the early stages, like development of the script together and those sorts of things, through to production, to post-production, to releasing the project. Though there's times where I've produced the project to a certain point, and I bring in a different producer because they have certain assets that they can help the thing get made. And on the other side, I've also been invited once a production is quite far down the line and be like, would you like to participate? So there's a lot of ways of when a co-production can happen, but at the same time, no matter when it happens, there's typically certain checkpoints or parameters around co-productions that are common to them all. So one of the big points is usually it's about raising money, about getting the money together for a project, and about jointly contributing towards the financing of the project. And how much each side contributes has a big impact on what do you get out of it financially at the end of the day. So that's a big part of co-producing, typically, that you're looking to somebody to raise a piece of the financing together with you, because on your own it's that much more difficult. So what are the main advantages of of co-producing? I think it's because you have different skill sets, right? Each producer has strengths and weaknesses, and it's about finding that fit. I mean, in my case, I'm more of a business-oriented producer rather than a creative producer. I mean, it doesn't mean I don't have creative energy that I bring to a project. I provide notes throughout a project, whether they're script notes, casting notes, notes on the cuts, et cetera, et cetera. There's obviously a whole creative notes process throughout a production. But I realize that my notes are not likely driving the creative conversations in a project, and I'm fine with that. So what I do is I partner with producers that have a high level of creative skills. So they're often writer producers or director producers and that sort of thing, so that so there's a good fit there. And if I do partner with producers who also have the business skill set, then we figure out how to share that workload, which you do ahead of a production. I mean, sharing the workload, I've always felt that two heads or three or four are better than one. And if you have a production partner, you have someone not just to bounce ideas off of, but the actual workload. So it's like there's the funding agency, so dealing with them, dealing with applications, just engaging them, lobbying them. Two heads, better than one. Dealing with once you actually get things going, dealing with the writer, with the director, the casting director, etc. All that building up to where you're actually in production, hopefully, and on set, you get to actually trade each other off if you have a co-producer. Because during production, the business side of production doesn't stop, right? I mean, the cash flows, the problems that the typical business side of it, there's always fires to put out, but production has their own issues in terms of 12-hour production day grind. So I mean, how do you find time to do both? I mean, that's one great reason I find to work with other producers that really helps share the workload. So as you get into a co-production, there comes a point where you have to have some paper together with the person that you're going to co-produce with. I think it's something Jennifer Podemsky raised up in terms of talking about producing, about paper. I thought that was well said, that it's important and it's nothing to be shied away from, as difficult as it can be, because at a certain point you have to come together with a co-production agreement with the person you're going to co-produce with, no matter what the stage. At the development stage, most likely that's when it most commonly is. You still need to iron out, okay, if we get this into production, what are our roles? What's going on here? What are you doing? What am I doing? What's other people at the table perhaps doing? And so actually I have a sample agreement that I was going to go through. It's not a sample, actually, it's a live agreement, but so I won't turn it to the camera. But just for the sake of the workshop, I just wanted to kind of walk everyone through some of the typical language that's in the co-production agreement, because that spells out the relationship between you and the co-producer that you're going to go together on a venture on. Let me see here. So, one of the first things is, what is the split between the two co-producing partners? Typically, the split is following along the money and the role kind of thing. How much financing does the one side expect to bring to it? Who's the leading partner in this? Who's come up with the idea? All these things you need to settle on. What is the split? And so, just to use this agreement here, the production will be 80% X and 20% Y of the co-production. unless you agree otherwise. So that's fine. That spells it out right off the top. You get the sense of who's the lead producer and who's not the lead producer. That's not to say that you can't have a 50-50, which is something I actually have with the main co-producing partner I work with. But that's something that takes working together and take a high level of trust, frankly, to get there. So, but typically, co-productions do lean one way or the other. So once that's established in terms of who's the lead producer, it makes the next steps a little bit easier, because this is the big challenge to co-productions, which becomes the decision making. Ultimately, let me just show you here what kind of language you would see in a co-production agreement. So here we have all key creative and financial decisions, not limited to budget, financing, script, talent, line producer, partnerships, etc., require the mutual agreement of X and Y. However, that co-producers agree that on a day-to-day aspect or respect to the development of the production and the execution of the production, that either X or Y will have a lead role. So what it is explaining is that, yes, everybody has access to everything. Everybody knows everything. You can't withhold any information. Communications, emails need to all be shared, but that ultimately somebody needs to have the final say, as we call it, in these things. In the agreements I work with, I often put a clause in that, notwithstanding the foregoing kind of thing, that if the parties aren't able to reach any agreement, that one party will have an override. That's just something I like to use in an agreement, so that the lead producer, it's understood that you need a few days to work this out. If you don't have that, the lead producer will actually have the right to make the decision at that point. I mean, there's other ways you can put that in a third party's hands in terms of arbitration, particularly for a larger production. You may want to have another party that says, okay, we can't decide how to move forward on co-production, so let's get somebody else involved. So what else is in this particular co-pro? I mean, so those are the big points, though, for sure, that idea of final say. But, then just wondering if this is somebody asking something. No, we're good. Yeah, so then I'm just looking through here. There's the financing development. So again, mutually develop, mutually agreed on what the development will be and how you go about it. The production schedule, the budget. These are all things that you can spell out in an agreement so that it's understood specifically what's in here. So it's not just general. It's like, no, that there needs to be meaningful participation in the development of these important parts of the production, and there needs to be a co-financing. There needs to be both parties bringing financing to the table. If both parties don't, then that's a big part of the co-production that falls apart, and in fact, the co-production itself could fall apart if the one party is unable to raise what they've committed to in an agreement like this. So, I mean, and that's it. It's a simple 3-pager. It could be 1 page. It could be, the truth is, it could be an email at the end of the day, and it's that simple. That both parties have come together and spell out how you're going to work together, and then make it work. So, I mean, so that all being said, I'm sure you're thinking, well, that's quite a relationship. It's like a marriage when I think about it, and so perhaps that's a good way to think about it. I mean, we look at our marriage partners, you know, we don't just rush into it. So so the idea of finding a co-producer is a big one. It's a very important step. Um, so yeah, let me give you a bit of how I've found and came to do a lot of co-productions. So the person I co-produce a lot with for over 10 years now is actually Floyd Kane. He first invited me to co-produce a show, TV show he wrote called North South. And that was the show set in Halifax. Actually, it's more like 15 years ago, maybe. How time flies. But yeah, so we co-produced the show. It was a great show. It had some really interesting cultural kind of aspects to it about a Black family. And he's a very passionate writer, a producer, and we hit it off. And we've actually been co-producing quite a bit ever since. Though I do some projects on my own, he does some on his own. For the most part, we come together and co-produce a lot. So so that's how I started co-producing with Floyd. Now Floyd and I are about to co-produce a film up north, and we recently brought on another producer onto the project who was introduced to us by a funding agency. So that's a source in terms of funding agencies are helpful to find out who are producers, that they see a lot of things happening, a lot of different people and company coming through, and they can kind of do a bit of matchmaking. And so we actually met this producer several months ago, like early in the new year, if not even before that. And I'd heard of him before and things like that. Good reputation. We meet, we talk, and it was like really great vibe. And then, and there was a sense we could work together. And then, sure enough, we have this film up north. And then he's able to bring a piece of financing to the table through a distributor and come on board as a producer. And then the fit was there. It was like, okay, let's do this. And so that's how that's working. And of course, you know, we have a co-producing agreement, spells out all the roles and everything, and it's working out really well. I've also met producers that I've worked with over the years at various festivals and industry events, whether here in Canada, at TIFF, at Cinefest, at all these different places that you can meet people. That is also an opportunity to find a co-producer if you're looking to co-produce, either as a producer looking for a project or a producer with a project looking to share it with someone. So those are really an excellent way to get into co-production. I mean, the key is to meet a potential co-producer, and what I would suggest is not to jump in right away, because as we know in this business, there's also those people who look to take advantage or to do this or that, and so it's good to kind of rub shoulders a bit. A little bit harder to do in this COVID world, but it's to really get to know them a bit and see what they're about and talk about the project and feel it out, because as often as I've joined up with producers, I've stepped away from producers where it's like you don't see the thing clearly. You're not seeing it the same, whether it's something I've been invited onto or something that I thought somebody could help me co-produce, but it wasn't a fit at the end of the day. So the idea of forcing it just for the idea of getting it made is a disaster in the making. I'm going to jump to a question kind of in that zone, talking about finding co-producers and that sort of thing. And the question from Dorval is, for emerging filmmakers, what are the most important things to look at when choosing a co-producer? Well, as I've been saying, it's almost something you can't uh, spell out. It's that vibe. It's like that marriage thing, when you meet somebody, how do that relationship thing. It's kind of that where production is a long slog. You're going to be with this person possibly for years, and it's going to be intimate in that you're tied creatively, financially, and your reputation. There's so many things tied together that you really need to trust your gut, I guess what I'm saying, when you get into these co-production relationships, and really feel that you know a year or two from now you're still going to be friends with this person. I mean, obviously, to have a friendship there is an asset as well, not just a straight up business partnership, because they do go that deep. Um, as far as important things to look at, um, yeah, call around. I would even say, and I've done that. Call around. You know, some producers say they've done this and that, but you've got to dig and make sure that they're being honest. So that's the biggest thing you're looking for, is honesty. That they don't overplay themselves. That they don't, that whatever they're saying, whatever they're promising, whatever you've ever heard about them, you've got to dig and find out. I'd say that's so important, particularly for an emerging filmmaker, because of course there's all sorts of stories, and a lot of them are based in reality about producers taking advantage of emerging filmmakers. So yeah, do your homework, as I say. Check the person out you're thinking of, or that you're talking to. Um, Lindsay asked the question here: what countries have you co-produced with, and where do you get funding? So the countries I've co-produced with well, actually, the one country is South Africa. I've co-developed in the UK, and I'm currently co-developing in Scotland a project, and but South Africa is the place where I've done 2 TV series that I'd mentioned earlier on. One of them being the first Canada-South Africa treaty co-production, and the other one being a big budget medical drama. So, and where do you get funding for these sort of things? Well, on the TV side, it's a straight, typical, let's say CBC comes to the table with their piece of the financing. They want to do the show. And then you have a foreign broadcaster that is bringing funding to the table, and they want a license actually to the table, and they want to do the show. That is the fundamental of a co-production. You need the two sides pre-bought, like already bought into the idea to go and co-produce on the TV side. That's what you need. And the other sources of funding are CMF, Canadian Media Fund, the tax credits over here. Those are the key sources of funding. There's other, smaller sources of funding out of the different provinces. And the interesting thing with official treaty co-production, it's called, is that in each country, they're able to bring their local money to the table as well. It's regarded as a, South African content, or a UK content, or an Australian content show. In Canada, it's regarded as a Canadian content show, which is why we can bring all the tax credits in that at a high level to the table in CMF. So if you're looking to co-produce with the US, that's a whole different matter. We do not have a treaty with the US. And the truth is that our treaties are designed to counter the US programming that's all of the countries around the world are flooded with US content. So it's a way to combat that by having treaties with countries. We have all these co-production treaties, so we can create content at a bigger budget level that competes with the U.S. content on some level. So there is no treaty with the U.S. Oh, that's an interesting question from Adam. What happens when your co-producer goes bankrupt? Well, I hope that's something I never have to find out. I've never had that. But the truth is, there's all sorts of protections co-producers place in our co-production agreements that allow for that unforeseen type of circumstance where someone goes bankrupt. All rights typically revert to the co-producer that's not bankrupt, or they vest with them. They go to them so they can carry on with the production, that sort of thing. Yeah. So as questions keep coming in, I was going to talk a bit about co-producing in terms of culturally sensitive projects, and so of course, so Indigenous projects, and I've had a lot of experience with Black projects as well. And in terms of co-production, when you're talking about something that comes from a certain cultural place, then things get a little more, how should I say, like careful, right? I think you have to even be more. You have to watch who you're partnering with when you're talking about this. I'm just going to answer one of these questions coming up here, which is that do you have to shoot in each country? Yes, for a treaty co-production, you absolutely do have to shoot in each country, because the minimum requirement is usually treaty co-productions that 20% of the money be raised out of that country. Now, technically, it's possible to do just co-production out of one of the countries, but practically, often it turns into a shoot in both countries, because if you're doing just post-production these days is only about 7% of a budget, so it's hard to get to 20%. Though you could have theoretically the director and some cast and just co-production, or sorry, post-production from one country and no actually shooting there. That's the exception. It's certainly not typical. So back to the conversation around culturally, projects and co-productions. And I know that throughout the years, I've certainly, as a Black producer, been approached by various producers, writers, directors, with material that has a Black lead, has a Black story, and they're not Black, and they say, they'd like to have a Black producer on board. So that's an odd place. That's a funny place to be. I mean, it's like, that's great if the material is great and all that, but often what I've found over the years is that projects that come to me, they're looking to have a stamp of approval on it, or have me on as executive producer or something like that, and that they've actually missed the boat, and they're not getting it, that this is not, I'm not interested in doing a great white hope story, so I'm surprised at some of the projects that still come forward, especially, of course, in this day and age, around that. And I'm sure from the Indigenous perspective, there's a similar caution there about entering into co-production, and particularly with a non-Indigenous co-producer. And that's one of the things I was going to talk about, or the couple of films I was going to talk about, which is Angelique's Isle, which I co-produced with Michel Desrosiers about, 5 years ago now. And just to give you some background on that project, having co-produced and developed things over the years, and trying to find interesting stories, fresh stories. And this is something Telefilm was aware of. They said, well, look, we have these interesting indigenous projects that had developed to a certain place, and then they shut down the indigenous funding back then, and so these scripts were languishing. So I reached out to Michel, and it was like, this sounds like a great project. And I'd also met Michel at Cinefest even years before, and it's like, if you ever I heard the story. It's a fantastic tale, a horrific tale, and I said, if you ever get to do this, I'd love to be a part of it. So even right then, I mean, way back, years before we came to produce her project together, there was that click that, okay, she got to check me out. I got to check out, like, okay, she's sincere at what she's doing. She's good. She's got all the talent. So it was like that kind of a natural fit. And then we entered into a co-production agreement to develop the show and to get it to camera. And in the wild ride that was there, which is typical in any development, trying to get to the budget, we both felt this was like a $5 to $7 million film. And at the end of the day, we're battered down to 2.5. Do we still go with it, or what do we do? And over 3 years of development, if not 4, it was a struggle. And it was interesting. I came to understand that Indigenous filmmaking is a thing unto itself, in terms of it's a way of storytelling. And the only way I could relate to that is, back to my Nigerian father and the way he would tell stories. There's a certain way of telling African stories. There's a certain thing, and so it's kind of in my head. I was like, oh, okay, this is how she wants to tell stories. So it was like getting behind that was very important. That certain things about telling a story wasn't necessarily the commercial Hollywood way to tell a story. There was a way she wanted to tell the story. And so a lot of it became a matter of bringing the different people on board, whether it was the funding agencies, the distributors, or whoever we brought on, to understand that. And so anybody who we were talking to about the project, it would be through Michelle's filter in terms of what she wanted. And that's how we got, a great DP and a lot of different things. And ultimately, the film turned out and won at some great festivals. So I think that was, for me at least, an initial lesson that there's more than one way to tell a story. My first interest in telling a story from another culture that I wasn't that familiar with, was I knew that there's stories there that can reach everybody, that are fresh and haven't been told before. But the lesson I learned is that they needed to be told in the way the filmmaker wants to tell them. It's not the other way. Not okay. Now here's a story. Now let's put it through the typical storytelling mold that Western culture. I learned that lesson even in perhaps a bigger way with working with Shelley Nero, with the incredible 25th year of Mitzi Bearclaw, which is a fantastical tale. It's and I hope you get to see that film. It's actually a recent production, and so the way that project came about was, it was initially, I heard about it through Telefilm had developed it to a stage, and then it never was moving into production. And so when I read the script, I thought, wow, this is pretty wild. It's an indigenous fantasy comedy, like talk about genre bending kind of a thing. And then so when I got to meet Shelley, and again we hit it off, and and she had already produced another film and written and directed it. So I got to look at that film, and I said, okay, let's figure this out. And we developed that script for quite some time. Again, for like 3 years. So back to the, watch who your co-producers are. This is going to be a long-term relationship. So so Shelley and I, together with a story editor, Ken Chubb, and his wife, now gone, Shirley, we developed the script, and I came to learn even more about Indigenous storytelling through Shelley, in her wanting to combine these fantastical elements as if it was just breathing, it was just natural, just to kind of blend. If anything, it reminded me of kind of an avant-garde, sort of the early European kind of more free form sort of storytelling. But there's certainly not anything that we get to do much in the Western storytelling. And so the big lesson for me was looking at this sequence of, she called it the three horsemen, of this fantastical outfits, and it's all happening in Mitzi's mind, these scenes. And in my mind, the simple thing was, because we didn't raise a heck of a lot of money. In fact, we didn't even have, everybody had their fees in at a certain point, until Home DC came in after the fact, after we started shooting. But everybody, including Shelley, put up all their fees. So next to no writer, producer, director fees were in there. But anyways, I thought, okay, we got to do something. Let's figure out if we can cut that out. And Shelley was aghast. It was like, well, no, this is how I'm telling the story. This is part of me as an Indigenous artist telling this visual story. And that was like, wow, I can't believe that I was pushing. By the time we got to the team, and everybody embraced it, and everybody loved that idea of yeah, this is the heart of it. You can't take out that. That's just because it makes sense financially and production wise, just to strip that down, or to minimize it. It's like, no, that's a big part of it. So so I think in finding a co-producer, I think you need to find someone who gets what you want to do in a big way. As I say, in telling, particularly an Indigenous story, and that's so important. And of course, there's, in my mind, it's not about just telling cultural stories. I think all filmmakers, whether Indigenous, Black, or whatever, should be able to tell, a variety of stories. I also don't like the idea that the only stories I can tell are Black stories. And I'm kind of intrigued that this film I'm shooting up north, which is a thriller, which has all white cast, which is just this, it's a great story. It's a great straight up thriller. I've really in my career not really ever done that. So it's kind of interesting this far down the line that to be doing that as well as all the the stories I've managed to tell. So here's a question from Anonymous. As a Black filmmaker, what challenges do you face to get your projects funded? Well, yeah, you have the challenges. I think we're all aware of them more than ever with all the attention around BIPOC issues. If you've been reading up on it or following any of that stuff happening, the challenges are, and they may be similar to Indigenous filmmaking. It's the typical: is this going to appeal to what audience is this for? Like, will non-Black people like this story or get the story? There's just so many obstacles, right down to are funders familiar with Black filmmakers and Black producers? If they are, that's great. But if they're not, how do you, people tend to stick with what they know for the most part. So those are the challenges. It's really having to break through those barriers however you can, um, and get your projects funded. I mean, the hard part is just sometimes is discerning what are the typical barriers to funding, because it's not easy, as you producers know. Any emerging producers on here or established producers, it's difficult to raise funding, no matter what. So when you throw a cultural, racial layer on top of that, sometimes it's like, well, is this about race, or is this just because they don't have the money, or they're just saying no because they say no to to whatever, or my project just creatively is not there, or whatever. So that's a challenge I find, like trying to discern and read the tea leaves as you're doing this kind of process. One thing I find is that you, as a racialized producer, that you can get a lot of lip service, which is challenging, where people don't want to say no. I'm good with a no. Just say no. Don't give me a maybe if it's really a no. But sometimes they feel, oh, well, I can't say no that he's Black or indigenous, I suppose, or whatever, and I'm not going to say no. Well, if it's no on the merit of the project, please say no, and I'll collect the no's till we get to a yes. So those are the sort of challenges, I suppose. I wonder if there's any more questions. Kind of zip through my stuff to talk about. I don't know if any of you are interested more in the business side of co-productions, or more on the creative, cultural side of things. Be interesting to know where you're at with some of your projects in terms of getting to a co-production stage, where you're looking for a co-producer, that sort of thing. I imagine the ISO, the Indigenous Screen Office, is a key place now that that's there, as far as a meeting place for co-producers to come to. Okay. So if there are no other questions, I've really enjoyed this. And again, thanks for the opportunity. And I hope some of this has been helpful. If anybody wants to reach out to me directly for other questions and things, I'd certainly be glad to help and share whatever I know. Yeah, I think we've covered. I mean, co-production is dry in one sense. It is a lot of business, but I've tried to talk about the softer side of it, which is so important to really get to know the person that you're thinking about co-producing with, and certainly feel comfortable checking them out and that sort of thing. Because once you're signed up together, you're in it for quite a while. Okay, well, if there is no other questions, I guess we'll wrap up here. And good. I'll say thanks and happy producing. Okay. Take care, everyone. Megwitch.
Remember that path behind our old house that took us further than any car could. A place to hide when we knew we should. Where we planned to take on the world with all its strength, with all that